Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm very glad that you're all here today. I'll welcome you in the name of the Revolutionäre Linke, Revolutionary Left in English. We are a Berlin but also Germany-wide based group and organization that's active here, and we're very glad to be hosting this event today. We're honored to have Hussam al-Hamalawi with us as our speaker. Hussam is an activist who has been active in Egypt but also here for over 20 years. He was active during the Egyptian Revolution 2011, which we'll be going into, and he's also a scholar. Hussam got his PhD at Freie Universität Berlin doing his PhD with the title The Second Republic, Security Services and the Counter-Revolution in Egypt. We'll start with Hussam giving input, and then we'll have enough room for discussions. I'd like to just make clear here from the beginning, this is a place where no form of discrimination is allowed, so if anybody wants to make racist or sexist or queerphobic or any other kind of discriminatory comments, please leave the room. So I'd like to give the word to Hussam. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I will be speaking about the left and the Islamists. My main focus will be on Egypt, and I will be recounting with you some of my personal experiences in Egypt. But I think that you can take what I say and you can easily find parallels in other parts of the world. Relations between Islamists and the left have been historically strained, to say the least, or to put it in a polite manner. In the 1940s, for example, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood members helped the government to break the waves of strikes that were taking place and which were also communist-led. In the 1970s, acting at the behest of the security services, Islamist students on the campuses were used by the regime, by Sadat's regime, in order to counter the left, and bloody fights used to erupt on the campuses. These fights also continued in the following decades. For example, I joined university in the mid-1990s. And at the time, Egypt was going through the height of its so-called war on terror, the first war on terror. And I got active with the Revolutionary Socialists on campus during my third year. At the time, the organization was a clandestine organization due to the repression. And I recall that actually probably my first 2 or 3 political fistfights and assaults on campus were conducted by the Muslim Brotherhood against me and my comrades, not by the security services at the time. I mean, you fast forward after the revolution in 2012, in 2013, we've seen mobilizations and counter-mobilizations where Islamists and leftists and secular activists fought one another in the Egyptian streets, and sometimes, using actually arms on occasions. And the leftists, for their part, they have generally and historically dubbed the Islamists as fascists from early on. I mean, the expression Islamofascism was not coined by George Bush, although he's the one who popularized it. It was already in use for decades before that in Egypt and in elsewhere. The left allied itself with the Nasserist regime in the 1960s, which repressed brutally the Islamists at the time. The left in the 1990s cheered Mubarak's war on terror. And I recall seeing newspapers at the time when I was a teenager and still fresh in the movement, of left-wing newspapers like cheering the police efforts in countering the Islamofascists. And you fast forward to the revolution, the worst and the biggest massacre in Egyptian modern history was conducted by the Egyptian military and the security services in August 2013, where more than 1,000 people were killed on a single day, and this never happened in our modern history. And this massacre was supported by virtually all of the left-wing organizations in the country at the time, except mine. Moreover, even like 1 week before the massacre, all of the leftist organizations, except for the Revolutionary Socialists, have signed a joint statement titled Ayn al-Fad, where is the suspension, that was directed at the post-coup government, lamenting them and criticizing them for being a government of trembling hands, which is a metaphor used in Arabic for hesitation and lack of determination. And you promised us to suspend the Rab'a and the Nahda sit-ins, so where is the suspension? Ayn al-Fad. And this was not the only massacre, although this was the worst, but in most of the massacres that happened afterwards, they were cheered by most of the Egyptian leftists. Sisi's nomination, Sisi, in case you didn't know, he was the Minister of Defense, and he's the one who led the military coup in 2013. And since then, he's been ruling the country with an iron fist for roughly a decade now. The left-wing Al-Tajammu Party, for example, supported Sisi's nomination in 2014. It supported the nomination of Ahmed Shafiq, who was a military retired general, and he was the official representative of the counter-revolution when he was running against Muhammad Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president at the time. So we have to, try to deconstruct this scene a little bit, to try to understand why the leftists have taken this position, and at the same time to talk about my own personal experience and my organization or my tendencies experience that was radically different from the rest of the Egyptian left. I think first we have to understand what is Islamism, because the term is very loose and it's being used to describe virtually everything, from governments that officially proclaim to be Islamic governments, like for example the Iranian regime or the Pakistani regime. In other cases, you have states like Egypt, which is usually presented in the Western narrative as secular, but actually its constitution says that Islam is the official religion. So usually when you say Islam, it's like you either talk about regimes, you talk about radical tendencies, and even among those radical tendencies, there is a wide variety. There are the ISIS types, there are other tendencies we call the takfiris, who basically excommunicate society, and they think that the kind of society they live in is an infidel society, and that they need to separate themselves from it. And then there are different schools. Others, some would say, let's separate from them and go to the desert or go somewhere else and establish our own Islamic communes, while others say you have to separate from them emotionally and psychologically and mentally and intellectually until the time comes for an Islamic State. Under also the same banner, you have movements like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which has been a mainstream by the Egyptian standards movement that included support from vast sections of the Egyptian society. On occasions, it was anti-regime. On other occasions, it allied itself with the regime. It took very contradictory positions towards the Egyptian revolution, which I will delve into in a minute. Under also the same banner, and people like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, advocated an Islamic State, but at the same time they said the road for it will come via elections. We will go and contest the professional syndicates elections and the parliamentary elections. That's how we'll do it. Other tendencies, for example, included the Jama'ah Islamiyya, which spearheaded the insurgency in the 1990s in Egypt. Now, those people, they tried to mix actually between two strategies. On the one hand, it's a strategy of Islamizing society by taking control of neighborhoods and trying to enforce a strict Islamic code on its citizens, and at the same time creating an armed wing which would launch attacks against government officials, against police officers, but then later, more and more, they focused on soft targets like tourists and the Egyptian Christian minority, the Coptic minority that we have in Egypt, which amount to roughly from 10 to 15% of the country. You also had another tendency, people like, for example, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, who are quite famous around the world since their leader Ayman al-Zawahiri later became bin Laden's deputy and one of the main founders of Al-Qaeda. And interestingly, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, actually, when they started, they advocated the penetration of the security services and the military in order to carry out a coup, so that this would be the easiest and the method via which you would shed blood the least, because they were, for example, they were concerned about bloodshed and they didn't want bloodshed. So they advocated a military coup, for example. That's how they initially started, which of course took them on a trajectory that differed from that aim much, much later. So as you can see, like to put your hand on what is Islamists or what is Islamism in general, it's a very challenging actually task to try to lump all of these movements in one basket. I will focus in my talk today on the mainstream Islamists, those who got involved in the political scene in Egypt, those who organized in public in Egypt, those who contested elections in Egypt, because they were the real force that you had to come up with a position vis-a-vis them. And they were actually the much more challenging political tendency that you had to confront in your daily life, not the other groups on the fringe. Again, the left has labeled the Islamists, all of them lumped them up in one basket as fascists from early on. But are they fascists? Or to talk more specifically about the mainstream Islamists, are they fascists? I would argue not. This does not mean that they are progressive. This does not mean that they are a force for radical change that people on the left like us would aspire to see. But at the same time, there is a difference between fascism and these movements. Fascism usually, and I'm speaking here in Germany, so I guess you're quite familiar with what fascism is firsthand, but it is a movement by the petty bourgeoisie, mainly, by the middle class in society, during times of instability, during times of political uncertainty, when you have a revolution from below that cannot actually settle the score really fast and swiftly in favor of the working class and in favor of the impoverished masses. The middle classes during that time, they go insane. They don't want to definitely descend to become workers, and they want stability. They want their worldview, they want their society, they want order. They don't want to see protests on the streets. And in that regards, the fascist movement, its number one target throughout history, and no matter what country we're talking about, usually the number one target has been the working class organizations, whether it is the political parties of the working class or whether it is the trade unions and other organizations. Of course, these are not the only targets, because we've seen, not just in Germany and elsewhere, that other minorities would be othered and they would be discriminated against and targeted and liquidated on many cases. For example, the fascist Al-Falange party in Lebanon, in addition to targeting working class organizations in the country, was targeting also directly the Palestinian refugees in the country. And I think that this tendency is definitely seeping into the neo-fascist movements that you see in Germany and elsewhere. Now, so the fascist movements, they stabilize the country and they stabilize society in the interests of the ruling classes at the end of the day. And they are usually agents of imperialism. The case of the Islamist movements or the mainstream Islamist movements is actually different, even when on occasions you find them attacking the left, even when on occasions you find them attacking minorities. But the Islamist movements, especially the mainstream ones, their main aim is not usually, that we need to smash working class organizations to bring order to this country. How did Islamism evolve? Usually, the Islamists would try to allude to incidents and events and trace their lineage to 1400 years ago, to the times of the Prophet. And in that regards, they are not really different from other nationalist movements that usually trace lineage, like the Egyptian, for example, nationalists. They try to trace lineage to the time of the pharaohs. Elsewhere, they always find ancient civilizations and they claim that they are the continuation, of it. But usually, all of these movements, whether it's fascism, whether it's Islamism, nationalism, and what have you, these are modern movements that actually evolved in the last 3 centuries in the capitalist era, with the establishment of the nation state. And in the case of Islamism in specific, you can trace the modern founding father of Islamism is Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who was an Iranian scholar who traveled across the Muslim world in the 19th century. These were times when the Muslim world was under attack by the Western colonialists. And for someone like Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, he saw pan-Islamism as a way to confront the Western colonialists. So these anti-colonial roots of modern Islamism has to be remembered all the time when you're approaching this phenomena. The modern Islamist movements did not arise out of a defeated revolution in order to stabilize the country and smash the urban poor and the working class organizations, like we've seen in Italy and Germany and elsewhere, and also, and also in the Arab world on other occasions. Islamism traces its roots to the anti-colonial fights in the 19th century in our region. Now, if Jamaluddin al-Afghani more or less was like the Marx of Islamism, then its Lenin is definitely Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who founded this movement in Egypt, which spread across the Muslim world, and it had offshoots everywhere, and you can say that it is like the mother of organization of most of the modern Islamist movements. Now, Hassan al-Banna, his project was full of contradictions. Hassan al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928, 4 years after the collapse of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate in Turkey. And this was viewed in the Arab and the Muslim world with not as something to be cheered. It was looked at that it is part of this Western colonial onslaught. And different projects came out at the time for establishing alternative caliphates, while other also secular nationalists at the time said that maybe it's time for us to adopt a completely different project. Hassan al-Banna created the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And from the start, the Muslim Brotherhood, it had a trait which continues with it up until today. What is this? And it is the trait that is the source of its strength, but also it's the source of its weakness at the same time. It's a multi-class movement, meaning it includes different classes from different sections of society that actually would contradict one another when it comes to class interests. So the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, it had section of the traditional land-owning elite who were like pious, conservative Muslims, and they supported the movement, and they actually used to finance it on several occasions. They had section of the local bourgeoisie in Egypt. I'm talking here about filthy, rich bourgeois businessmen in the country who were also pious, who were also conservative Muslims, and they used to finance the movement, or at least support it on many occasions. But also they included, and that's the bulk of the movement, middle-class activists. I'm talking here about engineers, about pharmacists, about teachers, about journalists, writers, civil servants. These are the kind of cadres that actually compose the backbone of the Muslim Brotherhood and the mainstream Islamist movements. So always keep in mind this, because when they are portrayed as some medieval, mysterious force that wants to reverse time back to 1400 years ago, actually think that the contradiction here is that they are mostly technocrats. They are mostly professional middle-class activists who use technology on their daily basis. Also, among supporters of the movement, you will find sections of the working class and the urban poor and the farmers. So I'm talking here about basically a cross-class alliance that cuts throughout all society. This gives you the impression, and definitely this adds to the political clout of the organization. It's massive. When you look at it, from afar, they enjoy support basically everywhere. They have access to tons of resources. But this is also Achilles' heels for them, because this means that they cannot take a concrete position towards any single issue. They cannot, especially when they are in power. As long as they are in the opposition, they are all the time trying to come up with a rhetoric that is very vague, that is very general, that avoids giving concrete solutions or concrete stands towards anything, unless for fear of alienating sections in their own society, in their own organizations. So, for example, for a very long time, until the revolution, we never really knew, are the Muslim Brotherhood for privatization or against privatization? We never knew, because they would say one thing on one day, the other day they would say a completely different thing. When you would ask them about economic programs, they would come up with the most vague kind of slogans. Even their electoral slogans usually were very general and very vague, along the line of Islam is the solution. But they don't tell you, okay, so I mean, how does that translate into? In addition to the fact that on so many occasions, when the tide of struggle was very high against the regime, and I'm talking here the tide of like either social struggle or like political struggles, you will find that they usually resorted to the cultural wars as a safe haven for them. So they would talk about like, morals in society and how it's corrupted. They would launch some censorship campaigns against books and against movies that were deemed un-Islamic, or against like, Islamic culture and Islamic ideals and values. So all the time they have been vacillating, and whenever they took any concrete position at any point, there were always splits, because they would definitely alienate some section in their society. So how did we as revolutionary socialists in Egypt at the time relate to them? My movement started in the late 80s, the beginning of the 1990s. I belong to the second generation that joined the organization in the second half of the 1990s. And it is my generation that rebuilt the left on the campuses after it was completely destroyed by the beginning of the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The history of Egyptian communism is divided into waves, because it literally used to come as a wave, and then disappear. And then there is no continuation for a decade or a few years, and then you find like another wave coming up, and then it goes down and disappears. So by 1991, the third wave was officially over, and it's my generation that started the fourth wave. But while we were trying to rebuild our presence on the campuses and rebuild the leftist cells on the campuses, our biggest challenge at the time was the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, in addition to the security repression, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood had the upper hand at the time. They had thousands and thousands of cadres, basically on any university campus on any day. Just in case you didn't know, Egyptian universities are massive. I mean, you're talking Cairo University is 180,000 students. Ain Shams University, which is also located in Cairo, it's 150,000 students. And the Egyptian regime has been late to learn the lessons that the Western ruling classes here have learned after 1968, which is, fragment the student community into separate, campuses, that are very far away. In Egypt, it was like a workers' assembly line, basically. Students in the thousands could be found on any given day on the campus. And the Muslim Brotherhood had the upper hand. The Islamic Jihad and the Jama'ah Islamiyya had also, presence, but literally their cadres were either taken off campus and executed, or they disappeared by the security services, or they faced torture in the state security police dungeons. State security police is our version of the FBI or the Gestapo, to be honest. So when my generation was starting, the Muslim Brotherhood was everywhere. I mean, they were with us in the classrooms, they were with us on the campuses. If we tried to organize in the professional syndicates, they were there. And the Egyptian regime at the time was, I mean, after being done with the radicals in the first 2 or 3 years of the insurgency that started in 1992, basically shifted its attention to the reformist wing, which was the Muslim Brotherhood. The regime nationalized the professional syndicates and extended its control by the so-called Law 100 to control all the professional syndicates. Muslim Brotherhood leaders were tried in military courts. Continuous crackdowns happened on the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. And actually, the Muslim Brotherhood was on the retreat. They did not confront the regime because, once again, they are always vacillating between confronting or trying to reach some accommodation with them. At the time when we were starting in the mid-1990s, and at the time when the Muslim Brotherhood leaders were being prosecuted in military courts, in their exhibitions in Egypt, the student movement usually operated via exhibitions, so that on the university campus, you would come and you would write a series of articles on big boards, and you would put them on the ground, and you would fix them using, like, 4 rocks and others, and then you would start, like, chanting and shouting slogans, or, doing even a theatrical act to attract the students, and then they would come, and then they would start, like, reading your articles and engage with you. We used to call this ma'arid, or exhibitions. The Muslim Brotherhood exhibitions at the time, they did not mention military courts. They did not mention Mubarak's name, even. In the 1990s, Mubarak's name was a huge taboo. You could not even whisper, his name at the time. And at best, if you were like non-Islamist and you were trying to mobilize on campus, you would chant against the regime, you would chant against the government, you would chant against some minister, but you would not mention Mubarak's name at the time. The kind of position that we adopted in Egypt at the time was the following, is that we are sometimes with the Islamists, but never with the state. Sometime with the Islamists, never with the state. How can this be translated in our case? Meaning that when the Muslim Brotherhood student activists used to get banned from running in the student union elections, we would extend our solidarity to them, and we will even demonstrate against their banning. When the Muslim Brotherhood activists were kidnapped and tortured, we would demonstrate in solidarity with the detained Muslim Brotherhood activists and denounce their torture in our exhibitions and in our protests and in our statements. When the Muslim Brotherhood were tried in military courts, we used to denounce military courts and denounce the trials that the Muslim Brotherhood were subject to. But when the Muslim Brotherhood made sectarian remarks about the Copts, about the Egyptian Christians, we were with the Copts against them. But we were not with the state, because the state always tries to present itself as the secular, progressive guardian of society that's protecting us from these hordes of reactionary medieval, Islamists. No, you could be against them and you could denounce the Muslim Brotherhood, but at the same time, you would not side with the state. On occasions, the Muslim Brotherhood activists I think it was in Cairo University or maybe Ain Shams, I can't remember now, they tried to segregate the classes according to gender, that they would enter and they would try to enforce this moral code. We would be there to confront them whenever this happens. At some point, the Muslim Brotherhood, and this happened, I remember, to my peers, this is in my generation, organized on campus, protesting some theatrical play or some music play that was conducted by, some students, as un-Islamic and as westernized. So we would organize a protest against the Muslim Brotherhood, and we would bar them from entering and disrupting the play. But once the police shows up and starts throwing tear gas, we would be with the Muslim Brotherhood against the police. We would be denouncing the police assault against students. It was a very tight rope that we were walking along, each time. And this is a very, we say in Arabic, موقف مركب. I'm not sure how can I translate this, but it means that it wasn't a black and white thing. We were on occasions with them, but on other occasions against them, but never with the state. When they organized against the war in Iraq, and when they organized in solidarity with the Palestinians, and I'm talking here about the late 1990s, even before the start of the Intifada or before the start of the war, the third or second war on Iraq, they would have their, stools and their stage, and they would, be chanting against the US, and they might even chant against the Western Crusaders, and they had their own discourse that is so much influenced by religion at the end of the day. We would not boycott this event. We would actually attend this event, but then when it comes to our turn, we would take the mic and we would start giving a Marxist or a leftist analysis of why America is attacking Iraq, away from this whole notion that it is a Western crusade. And we would talk about how our regime, the Mubarak's regime, is complicit. And this was at a time when no one was mentioning Mubarak. And I record that our cadres, whenever they made this, they would get applause from all the students, including the base cadres of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then their leaders and their organizers would try to hush them up. Because you'll get us into trouble, at the time. When we were working with the Muslim Brotherhood later in the in different fights, for example, the Egyptian judges in 2005, 2006, they carried out or they organized some demonstrations calling for reforms at the time. This was like a split in our state structures at the time. And we saw that it is actually that there is a chance to increase the democratic margin. The Muslim Brotherhood also were organizing on behalf of the judges. We worked with them, shoulder to shoulder. But at the same time, this was our chance in order to show their base cadres what our politics was like. And that how different we were from whatever ideas that they have in their mind. We never made any compromises. Like, for example, we never chanted their chants. And at the same time, we always maintained our organizational independence, because some people think when it comes to making alliances is that you hush, any criticism against those that you're organizing with. Actually, in our case, we didn't. And this is like an ABC tactic of the United Front that we adopted at the time. I'll fast forward and I'll try to finish up with this, and then we can discuss it more afterwards. The 2011 revolution. When we announced that we were organizing the protests on the 25th of January 2011, which is Egyptian National Police Day, and we decided to say, Happy Police Day in our own way. So we decided to organize anti-torture protests on that day. Because in case you didn't know, actually on the 25th of January, the goal was not the overthrow of the regime. This was not the ceiling that we imagined, that we could achieve on that day. Things evolved. The Muslim Brotherhood did not endorse the protests at the time. But I'm talking here about the Muslim Brotherhood leadership. But from day one, there was Muslim Brotherhood youth with us taking part in the protest from day one. And some leftists, they try to, who at the end of the day, are dealing with the Muslim Brotherhood as a single bloc, they will tell you, oh, it's part of a conspiracy. Like, the Muslim Brotherhood would say that they are not endorsing the protest, and they are not endorsing the protest, but they send their kids just in case, if things evolve. But it's not true. Most of those who showed up in our protests were doing that in contradiction to their leaders' directives and orders at the time. But then the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, when it became clear that things will explode, whether they are part of it or not, they endorsed the protest on the third day, the Friday of Rage, the 28th of January, 2011. And they organized with us in Tahrir Square. Their youth were with us. They were fighting with us. They died with us in fighting the counter-revolutionary thugs who were sent in order to kill us in Tahrir. But at the same time, their leaders were sitting with Omar Suleiman, Mubarak's spy chief and vice president, in order to try to broker a compromise via which they would leave Tahrir. And actually, they did reach a compromise, but they could not enforce it on their cadres in Tahrir. Their cadres in Tahrir refused to leave. I'm saying this because what I'm trying to get at is that you cannot deal with them as one bloc. They are neither progressive, but at the same time, they are not all the time reactionary. They are not there in order to stifle dissent, but sometimes they do. And you always have to navigate your way when it comes to dealing with them. But what I'm talking about here mostly is the mainstream Islamists, those who are involved in day-to-day organizing. And maybe, sorry, I took so long, I know, longer than the time we've designated, and I will continue maybe in the Q&A that we have. Thank you.